A quick announcement before we start today's program. Beginning on Wednesday, March 6th, MEI will be hosting a new regional studies seminar, the Post-America Middle East. This is a unique opportunity to engage with leading regional experts in the 6-week evening course held at the Middle East Institute. To learn more, please visit www.mei.edu/education. And now on to today's program.
From Washington, D.C., this is Middle East Focus.
Welcome to Middle East Focus. I'm Alistair Taylor, MEI's editorial director. Today we're going to be talking about Pakistan. We'll be discussing the latest on the conflict with India, the recent visit of Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, and the US-Taliban talks, as well as the political and economic challenges facing the government of Imran Khan. To discuss the situation, I'm joined today by two excellent guests, Madiha Afzal and Marvin Weinbaum. Madiha is a visiting fellow in the Foreign Policy and Global Economy and Development program at Brookings, and was previously an assistant professor of public policy at the University of Maryland. Marvin is the director of MEI's Afghanistan and Pakistan program, and a professor emeritus of political science at the University of Illinois. Now let's get started. Madiha, I'd like to begin with you and the issue that's been dominating the headlines this week, namely the escalation in hostilities between Pakistan and India. What happened, and where do things stand now?
Well, this all began on February 14th, although it's really caught the world's attention much more last week. It began with an attack in Indian Kashmir on paramilitary soldiers, killing 40 of them. The attack was claimed by Jaish-e-Mohammed, which is a Pakistan-based militant group, and India pointed the finger directly at Pakistan. Pakistan said that the attack was much more homegrown and stressed sort of the fact that the militant was a local Kashmiri and that the explosives seemed to have been acquired locally. So Pakistan sort of maintained its deniability, its plausible deniability, as it does. But India needs to appear muscular at this point, and India crossed the line of control for the first time in more than 40 years, since 1971, actually, with an attack in Balakot in Pakistan, entering Pakistani airspace. Pakistan responded with the retaliatory strike. No fatalities have been reported in either of those attacks, though India initially claimed that it had killed militants in its attack on Balakot. That hasn't been corroborated. So at this point, Pakistan has captured Indian Air Force pilot, and Pakistan's prime minister has extended a hand essentially to India, basically saying, look, you undertook an airstrike, we undertook a retaliatory airstrike, and let's sit down and talk about whatever we need to talk about. And actually said that, we're happy to talk about terrorism. India is, of course, very wary. Pakistan has also said that they will return the Indian Air Force pilot who was captured on Friday, sort of taking a unilateral step as opposed to doing this in response to what India is asking. So both countries sort of wielding a propaganda war domestically. Imran Khan seems to be doing quite well domestically, as in, he seems to have united the country. On the other hand, India, again, rightfully so, remains wary of Pakistan. So we'll see where this goes.
Marvin, how do you see this playing out, and how concerned are you at this point about the risk of further escalation?
Well, I think we're all concerned about escalation. Because we know where this could end up in a nuclear exchange, which would be devastating for both countries, existential issue for both countries. And as we're learning here, that if this were a nuclear exchange of more than just a minimal proportion, you could very well have a global crisis here. This would affect global climate and so on. So this is very important. I think what's happened now is that we've sort of slowed the escalation. The Prime Minister, Imran Khan's concession today that he would return without bargaining or anything of this sort, furthered the way in which the image that he's given here that he wants very much to be a conciliator, that he recognizes the dangers and he hopes the Indians have done the same. And I think they do. It is, as Madiha has just pointed out, there are public pressures on both particularly on Prime Minister Modi, because he's got an election coming up in April. So for the moment, we can take a little bit of a breath here in that it's not rushing in that direction, but we don't know what other events could follow. Let me say this, that both of them had to respond in a token way. And thus far, that's really what it is. No loss of life, although perhaps the pilot whose plane went down inside India did lose his life. But that aside, in a way, this may, if it ends here, be the best of all possible outcomes. But having said that, I don't know what tomorrow morning is going to bring.
To Marvin's point, Madiha, how much of a factor do you think domestic politics are in all of this, given that the Khan government itself is relatively new, given that Prime Minister Modi is facing an election in a few months' time?
I think domestic politics are huge. They're particularly important in India because the pressure there in the face of an upcoming election is just, by design, there's increasing pressure on Prime Minister Modi, especially given the fact that he has been pretty strident on Pakistan even before this. So he had to respond to the strike in Pulwama. I mean, really didn't have a choice. Right now, the way he frames a de-escalation will be key for him. As Marvin has rightly pointed out, the end game of a re-escalation is horrible. It's a disaster and existential, as he said. So while the incentive on Prime Minister Modi is to appear muscular, he can somehow still save face and command or wield some sort of narrative. What doesn't look good is the fact that India's claims have not been proven to be correct. So the claim that they killed many militants in the attack in Balakot has not been corroborated. The claim that when Pakistan downed an Indian jet, there was some kind of fight going on between the jets, that India had also downed a Pakistani jet. Again, that has not been corroborated. So, the narrative is slipping a bit from his end, while on the other hand, Prime Minister Khan, this is sort of the first foreign policy test that he faces. He's proven to be pretty adept at commanding the narrative, as I said, domestically. And so both have their domestic audiences and both have an international audience. In terms of the domestic audience, I would say that Prime Minister Khan has sort of shown the image of being a real statesman and has united even opposing political forces domestically. Internationally, he has a problem, which is that there are militant groups, non-state militant groups that exist on Pakistan's territory. And that's what the world sees. And until Pakistan does something about that, nothing is going to really change in terms of Pakistan's image. So, internationally, how successful he is wielding a statesman-like image, remains to be seen. Internationally, despite sort of the bumbling on Mr. Modi's side, the world still sees this as an initial attack on India, and then a round of escalation after that, obviously started by India on that side, but in response to that attack. So, domestic politics play a role, the international image plays a role, and it'll be sort of interesting to see who comes out where at the end.
Well, I just to pick up on that, the real irritants in the relationship will remain. Yes, but specifically this group, Jaish Mohammed. They have taken responsibility for it. Very likely it had to be an outside group that instructed the suicide bomber on how to go about this. This was well planned. This was not a young guy's escapade.
Not a lone wolf.
Not a lone wolf. So it has been with this group, Jaish Mohammed, and another group, Lashkar-e-Taiba, that India has been particularly focused in saying, unless you bring these people to justice, or at least get a firm grip on them so that their terrorist activities stop, really, we can never really get together. And then behind this, of course, is the issue of Kashmir, which remains unresolved and is likely to remain such for the foreseeable future, so that really normal relations between the two countries is still a distant prospect. The hope had been that after the elections were over, before this recent exchange here of militarily, that after the election was over, that perhaps there would be a restart here of efforts to put the relationship on a more normal basis. But because this has happened, it's going to be more difficult for him. Modi's opposition parties are all ganging up on him. And whereas it's interesting because Imran Khan, as Madiha suggested, if there were an election held today, would you agree? I think I would feel that Imran Khan would win easily. Yeah. And part of this is simply because there is no opposition of note for him to worry about. So, and I'd add one more thing about it. He seems to have taken the lead here in a foreign policy issue, a military issue indeed, in which we normally say, well, this is strictly speaking the military's. Now, he did say that they were free to respond to an attack without getting his clear okay on that. But I've just been impressed with the fact that he's been the spokesman, not General Bajwa, who heads the military.
To that point, the Khan government just passed the 6-month mark in terms of his time in office. Madiha, how has his government performed so far, in your opinion?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And I feel like this week, in some ways, has changed his 6-month report card a little bit, So I would say that he started out and changed it for the better, changed it for the positive, given the fact that he actually was facing criticism from opposition parties. Again, criticism that he had in some ways earned because he had been so critical of the PMLN when the PMLN was in power, that they had been pretty critical of him up till this point. But today, when he announced that Pakistan would return the Air Force pilot, it was to applause by all parties in parliament. So in some ways, this current crisis and his sort of statesman-like behavior and his really taking the lead in terms of commanding the narrative on this and really appearing sort of cool, calm, and measured on national television, this seems to have united those previously critical of him. So this has definitely moved him up.
I'd say for Pakistan politics, that's quite something.
Right.
To have them back the government, which they normally do everything they could to delegitimize.
Yeah, absolutely. And up to this point, I would say, that his term, he started off on a relatively high note, sort of talking about, the socioeconomic challenges Pakistan faces and about his plan for what he would do to fix those, but very quickly on was sort of hobbled by the debt crisis that Pakistan had to deal with. And his insistence on not going to the IMF meant that there was a delay in dealing with the crisis. He successfully now has gone to the Gulf countries, Saudi Arabia in particular, and gotten many billions of dollars from the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. That has only recently come to fruition, though we knew even from his trip in the fall that he was promised at least some billions of dollars. So this may set his government on a more stable footing going forward. But up till now, it has really been about sort of dealing with the debt crisis and dealing also with the opposition's clamor about his sort of political gaffes that he ends up making. He is a master campaigner, right? But he also, in sort of talking a lot, has made gaffes, U-turns, as people like to call them in Pakistan. And those really earned him some minuses. I will say he hasn't been able to do much other than a couple of things in terms of social policy. The one successful thing he started rolling out is a health insurance card for the poorest of the poor that his provincial government in the previous term had implemented in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa and now is being rolled out in Punjab. So that's one thing that is the beginning of a success story for his government. The other thing he has surprisingly managed to do is that he has managed to keep Pakistan's fundamentalists in check, which is something that Pakistan's progressives were not expecting from him. So the fact that he arrested the leaders of and members of the Tehreek-e-Labbaik Pakistan, which is a fundamentalist movement which argues for strict implementation of Pakistan's blasphemy laws, who have really taken to the streets in protest and caused sort of harm to the continuation of life in Pakistan, whenever a verdict comes out by the Supreme Court, let's say, that they don't like. The fact that he has managed to sort of put them away, at least for now, is a feather in his cap. Whether he's able to sustain that, we will see.
Let me just add to that. One thing that he has not changed is he's obsessed here with destroying the opposition leaders that have been in power, the Sharif family. Many of us thought that this was just campaign rhetoric. He wanted, obviously, in. He wanted to see this government thrown out of office, and then he was able to oust it through election. But he's continuing to pursue the former Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif and his family and those who were associated with it, and now also against elements of even the Pakistan People's Parties. So this obsession here is really the one exceptional area, I would say, where he's not acting in a fashion which I think best would suit good governance at this point. As Madiha pointed out, it's remarkable then that he's, at this point at least, he's getting support. But it won't last, of course, because these people live on their criticism of the government and are anxious, naturally, not to give it too many kudos as they go forward.
One thing that Madiha touched on briefly earlier was the state of the economy in Pakistan, which is a major issue. Pakistan's obviously facing a host of problems, including a balance of payments crisis, slow domestic growth, among other issues. Marvin, what in your view are the most pressing issues facing Pakistan at the moment on that front, and what is the government doing about them?
Well, what it's not doing is it has not tackled, nor that I think many people thought it would, the underlying structural problems that Pakistan has here. It doesn't raise enough revenue. That is, don't collect taxes. They are a rentier state, as they say. They sort of live off what they're able to bring in rather than what they can generate. What Pakistan needs most, of course, is to build its industries, to become an exporter. At this point, its balance of payments is just way out of shape here. And that means that it has to live constantly with the fact that just to meet its interest charges, as well as support the military, that takes more. It takes half of all of their disposable income. They've got a problem, too, in that half of what they raise, because of something called the 18th Amendment, they have to share with the provinces. This was supposed to be a devolution here of power, which would give responsibility for many of the functions of government to the provinces. It hasn't worked smoothly, and it takes, as I say, it takes a large part of whatever discretionary spending is available after you've paid for the military and paid off your interest. And those interest payments, I think, this year run to $12 billion. As Madiha has pointed out, Saudi Arabia has promised some cash transfers, but mostly it's in terms of, and also deferred payment on its oil shipments. That's just deferred, though. That's not a grant. And most recently has promised up to $20 billion in investment of mostly in the energy sector, agriculture, and this will be helpful going forward. Why the Saudis are doing it, that's another issue.
I wanted to ask specifically on the $20 billion in investments that Marvin just referenced that Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman pledged during his visit. How much of an impact do you think those will have in addressing some of the larger economic and structural issues that Marvin outlined?
That's a great question. I think In some ways, the larger structural issues are issues of, I think the largest one is tax revenue and raising Pakistan's tax revenue. And that's something that, no Saudi MOU is going to fix. And raising tax revenues and engaging in tax reform is going to be something that is necessarily going to be unpopular, but has to be undertaken. If there is a government that has sort of the space and the stability to be able to undertake such a reform, it is Mr. Khan's government, given that he does have the backing of Pakistan's military. So his political stability is not in danger for the next 4 years unless he has a falling out with the military. So he has sort of the political space to be able to undertake such a reform for now. Whether or not it wins him re-election is something that will remain to be seen. But he has only undertaken a small step, such as saying that only taxpayers are eligible to buy automobiles, for instance. So he has taken some small steps, but a much larger tax reform, and sort of the elements of it still need to be laid out. In terms of the Saudi MOUs, we will have to see A, if they come to fruition, and B, what the details of those are. One of the big criticisms of Pakistan's deals in the China-Pakistan economic corridor were that, these deals were signed without much transparency at all. And when the terms were made more public, the suggestion has been since last year that these may not be very favorable to Pakistan at all. And so the transparency of these and the extent to which these can be completed successfully will sort of dictate how useful the MOUs are for Pakistan.
Marvin, shifting gears a bit, one of the other major developments going on in the region is, of course, the talks between the U.S. and the Taliban being hosted in Doha. Where does Pakistan fit into this, and what would a US-Taliban deal, were one to be struck, mean for Pakistan?
Well, I think everybody recognizes there can be no general peace in the region, economic success for the region without Pakistan. Pakistan is a major player here. The future of Afghanistan depends on the region, and no country more than Pakistan. Now, the issue here is, for the talks, what kind of influence does Pakistan have over the Taliban, whose leadership, less now of the foot soldiers, but the leadership remains in Pakistan and has been under the protection of the Pakistan government as a in-reserve proxy force for that day when Afghanistan comes apart and the government needs Pashtun friends who will go in and secure areas of the country in what will be a horrendous civil war, and so Pakistan will be protected. But Pakistan's influence on the Taliban is problematic. It had the influence and it exercised it on at least 2 or 3 occasions when it brought the Taliban to the table just to get them to talk about having negotiations is where we still are. I think people think if you get them together, then 6 months from now you'll have a deal. Well, they know nothing about how you negotiate civil wars and insurgencies. Less obvious here is that whether they can get the Taliban to compromise. And here I have strong doubts. The history of the relationship between Pakistan and the Taliban is one of suspicion, but needing one another. Pakistan has never been able to get the Taliban leadership to do something which they felt was against their core interests. That remains the case. So if the United States and others are looking for Pakistan to somehow deliver the Taliban for negotiations, much less get them to settle down the road on terms that a power-sharing arrangement that people would find acceptable, which is itself a challenge, enormous challenge. They are overestimating Pakistan's ability to do this, and I think that, unfortunately, if you base your thinking along that line, you're going to be disappointed.
Madiha, we're running out of time here, but any final thoughts on that?
I completely agree with Marvin. One of my views is that it is unclear what kind of ultimate peace, if it were to be achieved. And Zalmay Khalilzad has said that there is not going to be peace unless all elements of the peace process are acceptable, which means the elements that are between the US and the Taliban, but also the intra-Afghan elements, the elements between the Afghan government and the Afghan Taliban. Until everybody is in agreement, there is no peace. And so it is still, while we are farther along than we ever were, it is still a far off prospect and much could go wrong. In 2019, where Pakistan is not facing domestic terror by the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan to the extent that it was in the past, and where much of the TTP either has been decimated or is on Afghan territory.
That's the Pakistani Taliban.
Yes, the TTP, exactly. The Pakistani Taliban, distinct from the Afghan Taliban, though they have links and important links. And right now, some of the TTP, the Pakistan Taliban leadership and membership is in Afghan territory. So the structure of a final power sharing agreement and what that does to a group like the TTP, the Pakistan Taliban, is going to be key for Pakistan. Any power sharing agreement between the Afghan government and the Afghan Taliban that in some ways ends up emboldening the TTP, the Pakistan Taliban, to restart its attacks on Pakistan territory, for instance, is not going to be beneficial to Pakistan. So Pakistan will also be watching what kind of power sharing agreement this is. And it is not in Pakistan's interest to have a completely emboldened Afghan Taliban at the helm of Afghanistan because of the fact that the Afghan Taliban is a group that will support the Pakistan Taliban, the TTP. That's just one element at play here. And then there are many others. Pakistan wants a friendly government in Afghanistan. That allows it to maintain its strategic depth. That allows it to maintain a friendly face on at least one side of its borders, its western border. And so what configuration that will take is something Pakistan will be watching. I think we're very much at a point of flux here. Pakistan has been conciliatory towards the US, given the fact that the relationship had suffered, especially in 2018 with President Trump coming into power and deriding Pakistan for taking billions of American dollars and not doing anything in return. When he's reached out for Pakistan to help in peace talks, Pakistan has sort of taken up that offer and is helping for now. We'll wait to see what happens.
So many issues, much remains to be decided. We'll have to leave it there. Marvin, Madiha, thank you both for joining us today. And thank you as well to our audience for listening in and to our production team for their work on today's program. We will see you all next week.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.